Anyone who lives in the town of Amesbury, England, is used to mystery, comfortable with the inexplicable. The town is located just around a mile away from the world's most mysterious structures in human history, Stonehenge. For years, this small town revolved around the allure of the unknown. Then, in the summer of 2018, the townsfolk of Amesbury were swept up in a different kind of mystery, one that was more urgent and looming than ancient stones. A murder mystery, a death that stumped authorities, then sparked international outrage. A murder that happened in a small English town, but with consequences that would affect the entire world. It's a mystery one family in this town just can't live with. Years later, they're still searching for answers. This is Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator and narrator of Dead Sleep, a weekly podcast made for people like me who like to listen to true crime before bed, but like stories that are gripping, not gory, compelling, cozy. If that's your thing, I've made this show for you. As we settle in for the night, a very warm thank you to all the new followers of the show. Atlanta, you are showing up for this show. And welcome all of my new listeners in Germany. There's a special German-themed episode coming up this Sunday. So don't forget to follow the show so you won't miss it. With that, let's settle in for the night. Get nice and cozy under those covers and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. Our story is a murder mystery, but it didn't start with a life lost. It started with love found. A love found between two lost souls who, after many years, finally seemed to be figuring things out. Don and Charlie were both in their mid-40s when they met in early 2018. They had a lot in common. They were both from the area, both were considered kind and loving, and both had struggled with substance abuse issues for decades. Charlie said his drug problem started as a young raver back in the 90s. For Dawn, it was alcohol. Years of drinking cost her a lot, and the loss that hurt her the most was her relationship with her young daughter, one that she was working to rebuild. She and Charlie each lived in their own temporary apartments. Dawn had her eye on a permanent home. In that summer of 2018, Charlie and Dawn were making plans to find a new place, a place they could maybe share together as a couple. Everything seemed like things were going well, according to plan, until a warm June morning changed everything. Dawn was busy getting ready to see her daughter for a scheduled visit. Charlie would later recall how they'd stayed up the night before. Charlie admitted they'd been partying, so they were tired, maybe, but otherwise, Dawn seemed fine. Dawn had been in the bathroom for a few minutes, and if she didn't get going, she was going to be late. Charlie heard some strange sounds coming from the bathroom, and when he opened the door, he found his girlfriend in the bathtub. The bathtub was empty, no water in it. Dawn had collapsed into it somehow. Her blonde hair was still freshly done, her makeup on, and she was fully dressed. She appeared to be having some kind of seizure. Charlie called emergency services, who tried to walk him through CPR on Dawn. Charlie looked down on Dawn's skinny frame. He was scared if he did CPR, he'd break her ribs, or worse. He called Dawn's mother in a panic, telling her Dawn was ill and something was wrong. Dawn's mother had been through this before. Most people close to someone with substance abuse problems has been through a routine like this. A frantic phone call, a dramatic rescue, a miraculous recovery, with big promises to change. They'll quit forever until the cycle starts all over again. She didn't know what was wrong with Dawn this time. One thing Dawn's mother did know was that her granddaughter, Dawn's child, wouldn't be able to see her mother that day, and she knew the girl would be disappointed. Again. Time passed, and when Dawn's mother hadn't heard anything from Charlie, she assumed the situation resolved itself. But when she didn't hear from Dawn or Charlie the following day, she grew worried. What if this one time was the one time that something terrible, truly terrible, had happened to poor Dawn? She soon got word that confirmed her worst fears. Dawn was in the hospital, in a coma. Dawn's family rushed to be with her and find out what was going on. It was an overdose. They didn't know exactly which drug, but doctors theorized, based on Dawn's history, that she'd taken too much of something. Whether Dawn had done this intentionally or it happened by accident, nobody knew. But doctors speculated this was likely an OD. Early media reports suggested that Dawn must have gotten her hands on some tainted heroin or bad crack. The quick media shorthand on Dawn was that she was a homeless drug addict who collapsed after a bad batch, which Dawn's parents knew wasn't true. They tried to tell the doctor their daughter drank, but she never touched drugs. Test her for something else. It's not drugs. It has to be something else. Maybe those protests sounded like the desperate wishes of a delusional parent, that in time they'd have to accept the Occam's razor of drug users. Dawn was in a coma on life support because she used heavy drugs and lied about it. Within hours, it would be her partner, Charlie, who discovered the shocking truth. That Saturday in June, after Dawn collapsed and was rushed to the emergency room, Charlie was getting ready to head over to the hospital. When he looked in the mirror, he noticed his pupils were smaller than normal, like 2 tiny pinpricks. He had a headache, which he chalked up to staying up late. But it was getting worse. He was vomiting, foaming at the mouth, and couldn't stand up. An ambulance was called to Charlie's house for the second time. Only this time, when the medics came, they wore full hazmat suits, head to toe, everything covered. Because if this was what authorities now feared it was, this wasn't a tragic story about 2 drug addicts who OD'd. This was an unexpected new chapter in a shocking series of poisonings in England, a case authorities thought they'd solved. But the terror that had gripped the UK a few months earlier, it was happening again. It was March 2018, 4 months before Dawn's sudden and mysterious collapse. It was supposed to be spring, but a few weeks earlier, nearly all of the UK was hit by a cold wave and a stunning amount of snow. The storm was called the Beast from the East because the powerful winds and icy temperatures and snowfall originated from the Arctic Circle, pulling cold air across Europe all the way from Siberia. This beast from the east was a chilling foreshadowing of danger on the horizon. Roughly 10 miles from Amesbury was a charming town called Salisbury, so tight-knit some of the locals referred to it as Smallsbury. And in March, an older man and his 20-something daughter were spotted together on a park bench. Plenty of people knew them. He was a retired guy named Sergei, and she was Yulia, his daughter, who was a student. They'd moved to the area more than 8 years ago. and they were known to be nice and friendly. But on that day in March, they were behaving strangely. They sat side by side on the bench, but they weren't speaking. From the back, it looked like they were shaking. Soon it was clear they were actually convulsing, in some kind of seizure, foaming at the mouth, until both father and daughter collapsed. At the hospital, with both unconscious and close to death, tests revealed a shocking and unprecedented toxic substance in their bodies. They'd both been poisoned with an organophosphorus compound, deadly nerve agents, that are known as Novichok. Novichok means newcomer in Russian. But this chemical weapon had been around since the early 1970s. Nobody knew who was behind these poisonings yet. But one clue was where Novichok is made. It's only made in one place in the world, in a lab in Russia. But who would want to poison an old man and his daughter? And this is where the story turned from a family having a quiet day in the park to something out of a spy novel. Sergei's last name was Skripal, and he lived a low-key life in Salisbury. But he was once a major player in the spy game, a double agent who was convicted of high treason in his native Russia for selling secrets to British intelligence. He was sentenced to 13 years in a Russian prison in 2006, but was later released and relocated to England as part of a prisoner swap between Russia and the United States. What kind of threat he posed exactly, it's unclear. But what British authorities did uncover was exactly where the Novichok was placed. Someone had put the highly toxic poisonous substance on the doorknob of the front door of Sergei's Salisbury home. During the investigation, authorities managed to track down 2 possible suspects. 2 Russian nationals who came into the country with fake names, fake passports, and were in that area less than 48 hours before they left and headed back to Russia. The residents of Salisbury were shocked and terrified. First, to find out that there was a Russian spy living in their midst, and second, to discover that 2 alleged assassins had come to town to kill the spy and his family. It was only natural to worry who was next. Was this attack one small part of a larger terrorism campaign? The poison could have been anywhere, in any form. The incident took place in a small area in England, but it was a huge international shitstorm. At one point in the investigation, Vladimir Putin himself came out and vehemently denied that Russia had anything to do with these poisonings. Meanwhile, less than 10 miles away in Amesbury, this Russian saga was barely a blip on Charlie and Don's radar. But now, here they were, 4 months later in June 2018, and Don and Charlie were in the hospital, unconscious, in comas, fighting for their lives. And tests revealed what authorities had feared. They had been poisoned with Novichok. Other than that, nobody had a clue. How was it possible? Where did it happen? And when? In the Salisbury poisoning, someone placed Novichok on a doorknob. And the substance spread so easily, one of the first police officers on the scene who came in contact with that doorknob was also poisoned. After several weeks in the hospital, all 3 people in the Salisbury poisonings, that's Sergei, Yulia, and the police officer, survived. In Amesbury, Don's family and Charlie's brother all prayed for the same miraculous result. With Charlie and Don in comas, they were unable to speak for themselves, and in the media, rumors abound about how they came in contact with Novichok. Maybe it was on some old cigarette butt they picked up off the ground. Maybe it was inside a hypodermic needle and they'd injected it thinking it was drugs. This type of coverage suggested that Don and Charlie weren't like the rest of us. They were street people, riffraff. And in a way, they'd brought this poisoning upon themselves. This spontaneous chemical attack, it happened to them, but it wouldn't happen to you. Don's family was outraged by this depiction of their daughter. It was like a double assassination attempt, first on her body, then on her character. They wanted to hear from Don what really happened, but they'd never get the chance. Don Sturgis died on July 8, 2018, at the age of 44. Novichok was highly toxic, easily spread, odorless, and tasteless. Potentially contaminated area for Don and Charlie was vast and hard to define. They lived in 2 different apartments in 2 different parts of town. They rode public transportation. They were social and mingled with all kinds of people. How were investigators going to pinpoint the exact place and time of contamination? Their best hope, their only hope, was their only living witness, Don's partner, Charlie Rowley. Charlie was still in a coma and hanging by a thread. There is no single magical antidote to Novichok. I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I dipped into the treatments listed in the National Library of Medicine, and the way I understand it is there are a few different ways to neutralize the effects of Novichok to protect your brain, nervous system, and heart. It's the timing of these treatments that really counts. When Dawn arrived at the hospital back in June of 2018, no one knew what was wrong with her. But by the time Charlie arrived, doctors were able to administer life-saving drugs quickly. And those early treatments helped save his life. He came out of his coma on July 10th, 2 days after Dawn's passing. Authorities needed Charlie to tell them everything he knew. But Charlie's brain felt like it was upside down. He could barely remember anything, even Dawn's name and who she was in his life. It was all a blur to him at first. But there was a name that eventually came into focus, a name directly connected to the poison. And it wasn't Vladimir Putin. The name was Nina Ricci. Maria Nina Ricci was a French fashion designer who founded the House of Nina Ricci in Paris in the 1930s. The designer herself passed away decades ago, but Nina Ricci as a brand is well known all over the world, especially for perfume. I remember my mom wearing Nina Ricci's L'air du Temps all throughout the 80s. Charlie encountered Nina Ricci for the first time on the label of a bottle of perfume he found on June 27, 2018. He uncovered the unopened package of perfume while rummaging through a bin outside a charity shop. The perfume looked nice. He thought maybe Dawn would like it. Charlie slipped the perfume into his pocket and headed back home. The name of that Nina Ricci fragrance was Premier Jour. In French, that means first day. It was ironic, painfully so, because on that morning, on June 30th, when Charlie gave Dawn the perfume as a gift, it was the last day, he saw her alive. With Charlie out of his coma, investigators probed him about that perfume. And he shuddered at the memory. How around 8 a.m., after a late night, Dawn got up to get ready for her day with her daughter. Charlie remembered the perfume in his pocket and gave it to Dawn as a gift. Charlie remembered Dawn being pleased when he gave her the perfume. Dawn said she recognized the name. It was a good brand. Dawn asked Charlie to open it for her. The plastic was too heavy to open with her fingers. Charlie recalled walking into the kitchen, grabbing a kitchen knife, and cutting the plastic packaging open, a little sloppily. When he took out the small bottle, about the size of a tube of lipstick, a bit of it dripped onto his hands. He noticed the liquid was a little oily, and it didn't smell like perfume or anything. He washed his hands, then walked back into the bathroom, handed the bottle to Dawn, who happily spritzed the perfume under her wrists and rubbed them together. It was a hot day. She had bare arms, and she sprayed the perfume directly onto her bare skin. Dawn also remarked that the perfume didn't really smell. She offered Charlie her wrist to take a whiff. Together, they unknowingly rubbed directly into their skin and inhaled into their lungs one of the deadliest chemical weapons in the world. Within 15 minutes, Dawn collapsed in that bathtub, unconscious, and never woke up. For a long time afterward, Charlie felt a crushing weight of guilt. If he'd never found that bottle, if he'd never given it to Dawn, he worried that Dawn's family was going to blame him for Dawn's death. But Dawn's family didn't blame Charlie. Who deserved the blame? That was more complicated and controversial. Over the next several months of the investigation, authorities had worked out there were 3 men directly responsible for the poisonings that happened in Salisbury, and they were ready to charge these men and make arrests. Only the men weren't in England, they were in Russia, and there was no extradition treaty between the UK and Russia. So these charges, while valid, felt symbolic at best. Besides, these operatives were just following orders. They weren't in charge. The British government made it very clear who was in charge. The real beast from the East, Vladimir Putin. As you might expect, back in Moscow, Putin and his Kremlin cronies denied any involvement with the poisonings. The Russian ambassador even invited Charlie to come to Russia and find out for himself. The British government released a statement that there was no doubt that the Salisbury poisonings and the Amesbury poisonings were connected. Dawn and Charlie weren't the targets, but accidental victims. So who put the perfume with the Novichok in the charity bin? It seemed logical that it was those same Russian assassins believed to be behind the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia. And before they fled the country, they tossed the poison perfume into that charity bin, where Charlie picked it up and faithfully brought it home. Except the timeline was off. Those Salisbury poisonings happened in March, and Charlie distinctly remembered he found the perfume in plastic packaging in the charity bin in late June. He visited that bin a lot. He knew it was emptied and refilled multiple times a month. He couldn't make sense how that perfume was still there long after those Russian guys had left the UK. How the poison ended in an unopened package of perfume and found its way into the charity bin that ended up in the hands of Charlie and Dawn, that's the kind of stuff that nags at anyone close to this case. What if that bottle was a different bottle? What if there are more perfume bottles, more everyday products with a deadly chemical weapon lurking inside? In the years since these events, there have been more suspected poisonings using Novichok. The most famous example was, of course, on Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who collapsed on an airplane in August of 2020 after Novichok was hidden in his underwear. Alexei Navalny survived that attack. He even managed to fool one of the men behind his attempted assassination into admitting that the Russian government had tried to kill him. But tragically, he didn't survive what his family says was a second and fatal dose of Novichok that killed him while imprisoned in Siberia this year. Dawn Sturgis was the only death connected to those 2018 poisonings. But her family feels that her murder has fallen through the cracks. And it's not just the Russian involvement. They want to examine more closely what happened at the hospital. Were doctors negligent in not exploring the possibility that she'd been poisoned with Novichok much earlier? If she'd been a different kind of woman with a different background, would they have treated her differently? Would she perhaps be alive today? Dawn's daughter, now a teenager, has been relentless in pushing for an independent inquiry into her mother's death. And finally, after 6 long years, Dawn's case will be re-examined, beginning October 14th of 2024. It's remarkable to think how a few drops of something can lead to so much destruction. From the death of an ordinary British citizen like Dawn, to the tragic downfall of an entire pro-democracy movement in Russia. Even for the survivors, the long-term effects of Novichok are devastating. In recent interviews, Charlie remains fearful about his health and the long-term damage from the poison. Sergei and Yulia's lives were upended. They were reportedly relocated to New Zealand, and their friends in Salisbury don't expect to hear from them again. There was one point of destruction that brought hope. The apartment where Charlie lived and where Dawn was poisoned was deemed so dangerously toxic, the whole building had to be demolished. In 2020, it was announced that the empty lot would become a community park in Dawn's memory. A place with no dark history or ancient mystery. Just a wide open, lush green space where anyone can come and feel at home. Thank you, as always, for listening to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. If you want to know more about this case, I'm going to share 3 really critical links. And I'm curious to hear what you think. How did that bottle of perfume get in the charity bin? Who do you think put it there? And when? You can share your thoughtful theories in a voice memo and share it on Spotify. You can also reach out to me at deadsleeppodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to be able to play some of these theories on a future episode, so I look forward to hearing from you. I'll be back this Sunday with a special bonus episode. Until then, nighty-night.